the baggage he forgot. Every night, without fail and without mercy, the train left without him, and no matter how hard Arthur Pendleton tried to understand why, the answer always seemed to dissolve into the same cold, impenetrable fog that wrapped itself around the silent station like a memory refusing to be remembered. The platform stretched endlessly beneath dim, yellowed lamps that flickered as though they too were struggling to hold on to something already slipping away, and the air carried a damp chill that seeped through his clothes and settled deep into his bones, making him feel not merely cold but forgotten, as though time itself had passed him by and left him standing there among ghosts who still knew where they were going. Passengers moved with quiet purpose, their footsteps echoing softly against the worn wooden planks as they carried suitcases, nodded to one another, and boarded the waiting train with a certainty that Arthur envied but could not comprehend, because while they all seemed to belong to this place, he alone remained rooted in place, unable to take even a single step forward, as though the ground beneath him had claimed him as its own. He tried more than once to move, to lift his foot, to call out, to ask someone, anyone, what he was supposed to do, but his voice felt distant and unused, trapped somewhere inside his chest, and the harder he strained, the more the silence pressed in around him until even the sound of the departing train began to feel like something happening in another world entirely. Then, as always, the conductor appeared. He emerged from the fog with slow, deliberate steps, his uniform crisp in a way that felt out of place in the drifting haze, his face obscured not by shadow but by something far more unsettling, the complete absence of features, as though he were not a man at all, but an idea given shape, a presence that did not need eyes to see or a mouth to speak. He stopped in front of Arthur, tilting his head ever so slightly, as if examining something that had been left unfinished. "Ticket," he said, though Arthur had never once seen him actually check one. Arthur instinctively reached into his pockets, though he already knew there would be nothing there, and as his empty hands came back into the dim light, the conductor gave the same quiet, almost patient response he had given every night. "Your train hasn't come yet, because you forgot your baggage." The words lingered in the air long after they were spoken, echoing not in the station, but somewhere deep inside Arthur's mind, where they settled heavily, like something he should understand but could not yet face. Before he could ask what it meant, before he could demand an explanation or even take a step closer, the whistle of the train pierced through the fog, long and mournful, and the doors closed one by one with a finality that made his chest tighten as if something inside him were being sealed away along with them. The train began to move, slowly at first, then faster, its wheels grinding against the tracks as it disappeared into the distance, taking with it every passenger, every voice, every trace of warmth, until only silence remained, thick and absolute. Arthur stood alone on the platform, the fog closing in around him, the lamps flickering weaker and weaker, and for a moment, just a moment, he felt something dangerously close to panic, a rising, desperate realization that if he stayed there any longer, he might never leave at all. And then he woke. The darkness of his bedroom pressed in from all sides, familiar yet no less suffocating, and his breath came in short, uneven bursts as he pushed himself upright. the sheets damp beneath his hands and his heart still pounding as though it had not yet realized the train was gone. The steady ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway reached him through the silence, each second measured with quiet indifference, as though time, unlike the dream, had no intention of waiting for him to catch up. Arthur ran a hand over his face, his fingers rough and worn, catching slightly against the lines of age and years of labor, and for a long moment he simply sat there, staring into the dark, trying to convince himself that it had been nothing more than a dream. But the words remained. "You forgot your baggage." And though he did not yet understand why, he could not shake the feeling that whatever he had left behind was not something the night would allow him to ignore much longer. Morning arrived slowly, as it often did in Arthur Pendleton's house, not with the brightness of something new, but with the quiet persistence of something that had done this all before and would do it again whether he welcomed it or not. Slipping through the thin curtains in pale strips of light that stretched across the worn wooden floor and settled against the walls like silent witnesses to another day beginning exactly as the last one had ended. Arthur rose from his bed with the careful, deliberate movements of a man who had long since learned to listen to the small protests of his body, his joints stiff from years of work and the slow passage of time, and as his feet touched the cool floor, he paused for a moment, steadying himself not just physically but mentally, as though preparing to step into a life that had grown quieter than he had ever intended it to be. The house greeted him with the same stillness it always held, a stillness that was not peaceful but hollow, filled not with rest but with absence, and as he moved down the hallway, the ticking of the grandfather clock grew louder, its steady rhythm marking each passing second with a precision that felt almost accusatory, as though reminding him of something he had yet to do. In the kitchen, he poured water into the old drip coffee maker, the familiar sound of it beginning its slow, patient work filling the silence in a way that felt both comforting and insufficient, because while it mimicked the routine of a life once shared, it could not replace the quiet conversations that used to accompany it, nor the soft presence that had once made even the smallest moments feel complete. The smell of coffee soon followed, rich and grounding, mixing with the faint, lingering scent of wood and linseed oil that drifted in from the workshop, and for a brief moment, as he stood there with his hands resting on the counter, Arthur allowed himself to close his eyes and breathe it in, as though it might carry with it something he had lost. Martha had loved mornings like this. She had filled them with small, gentle movements, the setting of the table, the opening of windows to let in the crisp air, the quiet hum of a tune he could never quite remember but always recognized. And even now, years after her passing, traces of her remained scattered throughout the house, not in any single place, but in the way things had been left behind untouched, as though waiting for her to return and pick up where she had left off. Her clock still ticked. Her chair still creaked softly when he sat in it, the worn leather yielding beneath his weight with a familiar sound that seemed to echo more loudly in the absence of her presence. And as he lowered himself into it with his mug of black coffee, the warmth seeping into his hands, he found himself staring at the empty space across from him, where she used to sit, where she used to look at him with that quiet understanding that had always made words feel unnecessary. He took a slow sip, the bitterness settling on his tongue, and for a moment, He considered the dream again, though he quickly pushed the thought aside, telling himself that it was nothing more than the mind's way of filling the silence, of creating noise where there was none. Instead, he turned his attention to the workshop. The door creaked as he opened it, and the familiar scent of sawdust wrapped around him immediately, grounding him in something real, something tangible. And as he stepped inside, the morning light caught the fine particles in the air, making them drift lazily like dust suspended in time. His tools lay where he had left them, each one worn from years of use, each one bearing the marks of a life spent shaping and restoring. And as he ran his hand over the surface of the workbench, he felt the grooves and imperfections beneath his fingers, reminders of the countless hours he had spent here, building things meant to last, things that had purpose, things that had meaning, unlike the silence that now filled the rest of his days. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls, a car passed, its tires whispering over dry leaves that had begun to gather along the roadside. And the sound lingered just long enough to remind him that the world was still moving, still changing, still carrying people forward to places he no longer knew. Arthur stood there for a long moment, his hand resting on the bench, his gaze unfocused, and though he did not yet realize it, the quiet that surrounded him was not as empty as it seemed. It was waiting. And somewhere beneath the привычная routine, beneath the steady ticking of the clock and the comforting repetition of his days, something had already begun to shift, subtle but undeniable, like the first crack in a surface that had held for far too long. That night, he would return to the station, and this time it would not be the same. That night, as Arthur Pendleton lowered himself into bed with the same quiet resignation that had defined his evenings for years, listening to the slow, unwavering ticking of Martha's clock echo through the hallway like a patient reminder that time did not pause for hesitation, he could not shake the lingering unease that had followed him throughout the day, settling somewhere deep within him like a thought not yet formed but impossible to ignore. Sleep came as it always did, not as a gentle descent but as something that claimed him all at once, and before long he found himself standing once again on the familiar platform, the air thick with fog that curled around the dim lamps and softened the edges of everything it touched, turning the station into a place suspended between memory and forgetting. Everything was the same worn planks beneath his feet, slightly damp and echoing faintly under the distant shuffle of passengers who moved with quiet certainty, carrying their bags, their destinations clear, their purpose unquestioned. The same muted glow of the lamps casting long shadows that stretched and disappeared into the mist. The same distant hum of the train waiting patiently, as though it had all the time in the world, time that Arthur, for reasons he could not yet explain, felt slipping further away from him with each passing second. He tried again to move, to will his body forward, to step toward the train before it left without him as it always did, but the invisible weight that held him in place remained as unyielding as ever, pressing him into stillness with a quiet, undeniable force that left him both frustrated and strangely afraid. And then something changed. It was not sudden nor dramatic, but rather a subtle shift in the atmosphere itself, as though the dream had taken a breath and exhaled something new into the space around him, something small enough to go unnoticed at first glance, yet impossible to ignore once seen. At the far end of the platform, partially obscured by the drifting fog, there was a bench that Arthur did not remember noticing before, its wooden slats worn smooth with age, its metal frame dulled by time, and upon it sat a small figure, motionless except for the faint, rhythmic movement of hands engaged in quiet play. Arthur narrowed his eyes, straining to see more clearly, and as the fog shifted just enough to reveal the details, he felt a faint tightening in his chest, a recognition that came not from logic, but from something deeper, something instinctive. A boy. The child sat with his back turned, legs dangling slightly above the platform, entirely absorbed in a small object he held in his hands, a wooden locomotive, simple in its design yet crafted with care, its edges smooth, its form familiar in a way that stirred something long buried within Arthur's memory. The boy pushed the little train back and forth along the bench, the soft scraping sound barely audible beneath the distant murmur of the station. And though the motion was gentle, almost absent-minded, it carried with it a quiet weight, as though each movement was tied to something more than mere play. Arthur felt himself leaning forward, his attention drawn not to the train itself, but to the boy's presence, to the stillness with which he sat, to the strange sense that he did not belong among the other passengers, who continued to move about their business without acknowledging him, as though he existed outside of their world entirely. "Hey!" Arthur tried to call out, though his voice came softer than he intended, barely cutting through the fog. The boy did not turn. Instead, he continued to play, the wooden wheels of the locomotive tracing the same small path over and over again, forward, back, as though caught in a loop from which he could not escape. Arthur took a breath, attempting once more to move, to step toward the bench, to close the distance between them, but once again his body refused to obey, held fast by the same unseen force that had kept him from the train, and for the first time since the dream had begun to visit him, he felt not only frustration but a growing sense of urgency. Why couldn't he reach him? Why did it feel so important that he should? The whistle of the train sounded in the distance, low and drawn out, and though the passengers began to board as they always did, Arthur found that his attention no longer followed them, no longer fixed on the departing train, but remained locked on the boy, on the small wooden locomotive moving back and forth in quiet repetition. Then, as if sensing something, the boy paused. The movement of the train in his hands stopped, and for a brief, suspended moment, the entire station seemed to hold its breath, the fog thickening, the light dimming, the world narrowing down to that single point of stillness. Arthur leaned forward, his heart beginning to pound, waiting for the boy to turn, to reveal his face, to explain the strange pull that now gripped him. But he didn't. The whistle sounded again, louder this time, and the moment broke. The boy resumed his play. The train began to move. And before Arthur could understand what he had just witnessed, before he could grasp the meaning behind it, the platform began to empty once more, the passengers disappearing into the train as it prepared to leave, leaving him standing exactly where he had always been, alone, unmoving, and now more unsettled than ever before. And as the train pulled away, its fading sound swallowed by the fog, Arthur realized with a quiet, chilling certainty that the dream had changed, and whatever came next would not let him remain a passive observer much longer. The following morning arrived with a heaviness that Arthur could not easily dismiss, as though the dream had followed him into waking life, settling into the corners of his mind and refusing to loosen its quiet grip. And even as he moved through the familiar motions of his routine, the brewing of coffee, the slow walk through the silent house, the brief pause by Martha's chair, there was an undercurrent of distraction that made everything feel slightly out of place, as though something just beneath the surface was waiting to be uncovered. He found himself returning to the image of the boy again and again, to the way he had sat on that bench with such quiet focus, to the small wooden locomotive moving back and forth in his hands, and though he told himself that it was nothing more than a fragment of memory, a random construction of the mind piecing together forgotten details, the sense of recognition lingered stubbornly, refusing to be explained away. By mid-morning, unable to settle into his work, Arthur made a decision that felt both casual and strangely significant, as though prompted by something beyond conscious thought, and he turned his attention toward the attic, a place he had not visited in years, a place where time had been allowed to gather undisturbed. The narrow staircase creaked beneath his weight as he climbed, each step releasing a faint puff of dust into the air, and when he pushed open the attic door, the smell of old wood and forgotten things greeted him immediately, dry and still, carrying with it the quiet weight of years gone by. Light filtered in through the small window, illuminating the space in soft, muted tones, and as Arthur stepped inside, his eyes moved slowly over the scattered boxes, the covered furniture, the remnants of a life that had once been fuller, busier, louder. He had come up here for tools, or at least that was what he told himself, though as he moved deeper into the attic, his attention began to drift, drawn not to the items he needed, but to those he had long since set aside. A box near the far wall caught his eye. It was unremarkable at first glance, plain, slightly worn, its edges softened by time, but there was something about its placement, about the way it had been set apart from the others, that made him pause, his gaze lingering just a moment longer than necessary. He approached it slowly, as though uncertain whether he truly wanted to know what it contained, and as he knelt beside it, the floorboards creaking softly beneath him, he felt a faint tightening in his chest, a hesitation that surprised him with its intensity. It had been a long time since he had allowed himself to look back. Carefully, almost reluctantly, he lifted the lid. Inside, the years unfolded in silence. Small objects lay nestled together, preserved not by intention but by neglect, a collection of moments that had once been ordinary, now rendered significant simply by the passage of time. A child's drawing, its colors faded but still bright enough to suggest the joy with which it had been made. A worn baseball glove, its leather cracked but unmistakably shaped by smaller hands. A handful of photographs, their edges curled slightly, capturing fragments of a life that felt both distant and painfully close. Arthur reached in slowly, his fingers brushing against the surface of these things as though afraid they might crumble under the weight of his touch, and as he lifted one item after another, memories began to stir. Not fully formed, not yet clear, but present enough to be felt. He could almost hear laughter. Almost. The attic remained quiet, the only sound the faint shifting of dust in the air and the distant ticking of the clock below. But for a moment, just a moment, it felt as though the silence had changed, as though it now held something more than emptiness. Arthur sat there, the box open before him, his hands resting still, and though he had not yet found what he was looking for, if he had even known what that was, he could not shake the growing sense that he was standing on the edge of something important, something he had avoided for far too long. And as his gaze moved slowly across the contents of the box, settling on an object still half hidden beneath the others, he felt a quiet, almost reluctant realization begin to take shape. The dream had not come from nowhere, and whatever it was trying to show him was already here. For a long moment, Arthur remained motionless beside the open box, his hands resting on its edges as though he needed something solid to anchor himself against the quiet pull of memory that was steadily drawing him inward. And as the thin light from the attic window settled across the scattered contents, his gaze fixed on the object that had only partially revealed itself beneath the faded drawings and worn photographs, waiting with a patience that felt almost deliberate. He did not reach for it immediately, not because he did not want to, but because some part of him understood, before his mind had the chance to catch up, that once he did, something long buried would no longer remain untouched, and the careful distance he had maintained from the past for so many years would quietly, irrevocably collapse. Still, avoidance had never truly erased anything, and after a slow breath that seemed to echo louder than it should have in the stillness of the attic, Arthur extended his hand, his fingers brushing aside the lighter objects with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the roughness of his skin, until at last he uncovered it fully. The wooden locomotive lay there, simple and unassuming, its surface worn smooth by time and by the countless small hands that had once guided it across imaginary tracks, its edges rounded not only by craftsmanship, but by years of touch, of play, of something that had once been alive with meaning. Arthur lifted it carefully, almost reverently, and as it settled into his palm, he felt the familiar weight of it, light yet undeniable, like the echo of something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. He had made it. The realization did not arrive suddenly, but rather unfolded slowly, piece by piece, as his thumb traced along the grooves he had carved decades ago. Imperfections he alone would recognize, subtle marks that spoke not of flaw, but of effort, of time spent shaping something with intention, with care. He could see himself in the workshop, younger, steadier, the scent of fresh sawdust filling the air as sunlight poured through the windows, catching in the fine particles that drifted lazily as he worked, his hands moving with quiet confidence as he shaped the small form, smoothing each edge, adjusting each detail, not because it needed to be perfect, but because it mattered. Because it was for David. The memory came more clearly now, no longer fragmented, no longer distant, but vivid enough to stir something deep within him. A small boy sitting cross-legged on the floor, watching with wide, expectant eyes, waiting for the moment when the unfinished block of wood would become something he could hold, something he could call his own. Arthur's grip tightened slightly. The attic seemed to grow smaller around him, the air heavier, as though the past had stepped forward and refused to remain silent any longer. And as he looked down at the locomotive resting in his hand, the connection struck him with a force that left him momentarily breathless. It was the same one. Not similar. Not resembling. The same. The one from the dream. The one the boy had been holding, moving back and forth with that quiet, endless repetition, was this very object, down to the smallest detail, down to the faint line along the side where his tool had slipped just enough to leave a mark he had never bothered to fix. Arthur shook his head slightly, as though trying to dislodge the thought, to rationalize it, to explain it away as coincidence, as imagination, as the mind's tendency to weave familiar images into unfamiliar places. But the more he looked, the less convincing those explanations became. Because this was not vague. It was exact. Too exact. He lowered himself slowly onto the attic floor, the boards creaking beneath his weight, the locomotive still held carefully in his hands, and for a long moment he simply sat there, staring at it, feeling the quiet, undeniable shift taking place within him. The dream had not invented this. It had remembered it. And if the mind had chosen this particular memory, this particular object, to place in that strange, unreachable station, then it was not random, not meaningless, not something he could dismiss with the same practiced ease he had used for so many other thoughts he preferred not to entertain. It was trying to tell him something. Something specific. Something he had not yet allowed himself to fully see. Arthur exhaled slowly, the breath uneven, his gaze drifting from the locomotive to the rest of the box, to the remnants of a time when things had been simpler, when words had not carried the same weight, when silence had not yet become something that separated rather than protected. And though he did not yet understand the full shape of what was unfolding, he felt, with a quiet certainty that settled deep within him, that the distance he had placed between himself and the past was beginning to close. And this time it would not stop at the surface. The memory did not return all at once, nor did it announce itself with any particular clarity, but rather emerged gradually, like something long submerged rising slowly toward the surface, its edges indistinct at first, its details blurred by time, until piece by piece it began to take form, drawing Arthur back into a moment he had spent years trying not to revisit. He remained seated in the attic, the wooden locomotive resting in his hands, but his focus had shifted inward, pulled away from the quiet stillness around him and into a past that no longer felt distant, but uncomfortably close, as though it had been waiting just beneath the surface for the right moment to return. It had been late afternoon. He could see it now, the workshop filled with the golden light of the setting sun, casting long shadows across the floor, the scent of sawdust still fresh in the air, the steady rhythm of his work grounding him in something familiar, something controlled. David had been standing in the doorway. Not a child anymore, but not yet fully a man, caught in that uncertain space where decisions begin to carry weight, where independence starts to clash with expectation. And though Arthur had noticed him immediately, he had not stopped working, choosing instead to let the silence stretch, as he often did, believing that words, when spoken too quickly, had a way of complicating things that should remain simple. "I got the offer," David had said. The words had hung there, tentative yet firm, and Arthur had nodded slightly without looking up, as though acknowledging the statement was enough, as though more would only lead to questions he was not yet ready to ask. "In another state," David added after a moment, the hesitation in his voice barely noticeable, but present nonetheless. That had been when Arthur paused. Not fully, not in a way that would reveal too much, but just enough for the rhythm of his work to falter, just enough for the weight of what had been said to settle into the space between them. "You've got work here," Arthur replied, his tone even controlled, carrying none of the concern that had begun to stir beneath the surface. "It's not the same," David said, stepping further into the room, his posture shifting, his voice gaining a quiet urgency. "It's an opportunity." Arthur set the tool down then, finally turning to face him, and for a brief moment, their eyes met, one filled with expectation, the other with something more complicated, something that had never learned how to express itself without restraint. "You don't walk away from what you've built," Arthur said, the words measured, deliberate, as though stating a simple truth rather than offering an opinion. David exhaled sharply, a faint shake of his head breaking through his attempt to remain calm. "I'm not walking away," he replied. "I'm trying to build something of my own." The difference between those two statements settled heavily in the room, neither of them willing to step toward the other, neither of them prepared to concede that both might be true. Arthur crossed his arms, the familiar rigidity returning to his posture, the quiet defense he had relied on for most of his life rising instinctively, protecting him from the vulnerability that the moment demanded but he did not know how to give. "You've got everything you need right here," he said, the finality in his voice leaving little room for interpretation. David's expression shifted then, not to anger immediately, but to something deeper, something more fragile. A flicker of disappointment that quickly hardened into frustration when it became clear that it would not be acknowledged. "That's the problem," he said, his voice tightening. "Everything I need according to you." The words lingered, sharper than they had any right to be, and for a brief moment, something in Arthur wavered, something that might have led him to respond differently, to ask, to listen, to understand. But it passed just as quickly as it came, replaced by the familiar weight of pride, of certainty, of the belief that yielding would mean losing something he could not define but refused to risk. "You'll regret it," Arthur said. It was not said loudly, nor with anger, but with a quiet conviction that carried far more weight than either of them realized in that moment. David stared at him, the silence stretching between them once more, but this time it was not uncertain, it was final. "No," he said after a long pause, his voice steady, resolved. "I think I'll regret staying." And just like that, the space between them widened into something neither of them knew how to cross. There had been more words after that, though Arthur could no longer recall them clearly, only the tone, the sharpness, the way each sentence had seemed to push them further apart rather than bring them closer, until eventually the conversation ended not with resolution, but with distance, with the quiet, devastating finality of a door closing. David had left. Not just the house, not just the town, but the space between them, leaving behind a silence that, over time, had settled into something heavier than either of them had intended. Arthur had told himself more than once that it had been necessary, that some lessons had to be learned the hard way, that time would sort things out as it always did. But time, he now understood, did not fix what pride refused to face. And as he sat there in the attic, the wooden locomotive still resting in his hands, the memory no longer distant, no longer blurred, he felt, with a clarity that left no room for avoidance, that the argument had not ended when the words stopped. It had simply been carried forward, unresolved, waiting, and now at last it was asking to be answered. That night, when Arthur Pendleton finally lay down once more in the quiet darkness of his bedroom, the familiar ticking of the grandfather clock marking each passing second with a calm indifference that felt almost at odds with the restless unease stirring within him, he did not resist the sleep that came for him, because some part of him already knew, long before his eyes closed, that the station would be waiting, and that whatever had begun to change would not return him to the comfort of repetition. The dream unfolded with the same slow inevitability as before, the fog gathering first, thick and low, curling across the platform in pale waves that blurred the edges of the world and softened the distant glow of the lamps into something dim and wavering. And when Arthur became aware of himself standing there once again, rooted in place as though the ground itself refused to release him, there was no longer any sense of surprise, only recognition, and beneath it, something deeper, something closer to anticipation. The station was as it had been, yet not entirely unchanged. Passengers moved through the mist with quiet purpose, their footsteps echoing softly, their faces indistinct but their intentions clear, each of them carrying their baggage, each of them moving toward something waiting just beyond the reach of sight, while Arthur remained where he always was, caught between motion and stillness, between departure and delay. But this time, his attention did not linger on the train, nor on the faceless conductor who would inevitably appear, nor even on the silent procession of people who passed him by without acknowledgement. It went immediately to the bench. The boy was there again, seated exactly as before, his small frame outlined faintly by the dim light filtering through the fog, his back turned, his hands occupied with the same wooden locomotive that moved in that slow, repetitive rhythm, forward and back, as though marking time in a way the station itself could not. Arthur felt something tighten within him, not sharply but steadily, like a thread being drawn taut, and though his body remained fixed in place, his awareness leaned toward the child with an intensity that made the rest of the dream fade into something distant and unimportant. David! The name formed in his mind before he realized it, unspoken yet undeniable, rising from somewhere far deeper than memory alone. The boy paused. The movement of the locomotive stopped mid-path, and for a brief, suspended moment, the entire station seemed to still with him, the fog settling, the distant sounds quieting, as though the world itself had shifted its attention toward what was about to happen. Arthur felt his breath catch, his chest tightening with a mixture of recognition and something far more fragile, something he had not allowed himself to feel in years, and as the silence stretched, he found himself willing the boy to turn, to confirm what some part of him already knew but could not yet fully accept. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the child began to move. His shoulders shifted first, small and uncertain, as though the act of turning required more effort than it should, and then inch by inch, he turned his head, his face emerging from the soft veil of fog until at last it was fully visible. Arthur felt the impact of it not as a shock, but as a quiet, devastating certainty. It was him. Not the man David had become, not the distant figure shaped by years of silence and separation, but the boy he had once known so well, the child with eyes too large for his face, filled now not with curiosity or joy, but with something far heavier, something that did not belong to someone so young. Tears traced silent paths down the boy's cheeks, catching the dim light as they fell, and his small hands tightened around the wooden locomotive, holding it not as a toy, but as something far more important, something that anchored him to the moment. "You promised," the boy said, his voice soft, trembling, carrying across the distance between them with a clarity that cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. "You promised you'd go with me." The words settled into Arthur like a weight he could not shift, not because they were unfamiliar, but because they had been forgotten, not erased, not lost, but buried beneath years of justification, of silence, of the quiet insistence that what had happened had been necessary. Arthur tried to respond, but the word caught in his throat, unfinished, insufficient, and as he struggled to force it into something more, something meaningful, something that might reach the boy across the space that still separated them, he felt the same invisible restraint holding him in place, preventing him not only from moving, but from closing the distance in any way that mattered. The boy's expression did not change. He did not turn away, nor did he step forward. He simply remained where he was, looking at Arthur with that quiet, unwavering expectation, as though waiting, not for explanation, not for defense, but for something much simpler. Something Arthur had never given. The distant whistle of the train sounded again, long and low, cutting through the moment like a reminder that time, even here, did not stand still, and as the first movement of passengers began once more, the world around them resumed its slow, inevitable motion. But Arthur no longer noticed. His focus remained entirely on the boy, on the tears, on the words that echoed in his mind with a persistence that would not allow them to fade, and for the first time since the dream had begun, he felt something close to fear, not of the station, not of the train, but of what it was asking him to remember. "You promised." The words repeated, softer now, yet somehow heavier, and as the fog began to thicken once more, obscuring the boy's face, softening his outline until he became once again a figure half lost to the mist, Arthur felt a desperate urge rise within him, a need to reach him, to say something, anything, that might stop him from disappearing. But he could not move. And as the train began to depart, its sound fading into the distance, the platform emptied, leaving him alone once more, the echo of those words lingering long after the boy had vanished from sight. When Arthur awoke, it was not with the disorientation of a dream fading, but with the sharp, immediate awareness of something that had already taken hold, something that would not be dismissed or forgotten. He sat upright in the darkness, his breath uneven, his hands gripping the edge of the bed, and though the room around him was familiar, solid, real, the feeling that remained was anything but. Because now, at last, the dream had shown him what it wanted, and it was no longer willing to wait. The hours before dawn passed slowly, stretched thin by the weight of what Arthur had seen and heard, and though the darkness of the room gradually gave way to the pale light of morning, nothing in the quiet familiarity of his surroundings felt capable of softening the impact of the dream, because what had once been vague and distant had now taken on a clarity that refused to be ignored. He did not return to sleep. Instead, he sat there for a long time, the wooden locomotive resting on the bedside table within reach, its presence no longer incidental, no longer a relic of the past, but something active, something connected, as though it had become a physical link between what had been and what still demanded to be understood. "You promised." The words repeated in his mind, not loudly, not urgently, but persistently, like the steady ticking of the clock in the hallway, marking time not in seconds, but in moments missed, in chances unspoken, in everything that had been left unfinished. Arthur leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his hands clasped loosely together, and for once, he did not push the thoughts away, did not attempt to bury them beneath routine or distraction, because it had become unmistakably clear that what he was facing could not be avoided without consequence. The dream was not random. It was not simply memory replayed without purpose. It was something far more deliberate. The station, the train, the conductor. Each piece, once disconnected, now began to settle into place with a quiet, undeniable logic that unfolded slowly but steadily, as though it had been waiting for him to be ready to see it. The train was not just a train. It was time. Not time in the abstract sense, not the passing of days measured by clocks and calendars, but something far more personal, the movement of a life forward, the opportunities that arrived, paused briefly, and then departed whether or not one chose to board. And he had not boarded. Not when it mattered. The platform then was not a place of arrival but of delay. A space between what had been and what could have been, where hesitation turned into absence and absence into distance. And the baggage? Arthur exhaled slowly, the breath heavy, his gaze drifting toward the locomotive once more, and for the first time, he did not see it simply as an object, but as something symbolic, something that carried with it far more than its simple form suggested. The baggage was not something he had forgotten to bring. It was something he had refused to carry. The weight of what he had said. The weight of what he had not said. The apology that had never been spoken, not because it had not been needed, but because he had convinced himself that time would offer another opportunity, that things would settle, that distance would soften what pride had hardened. But time had not waited. It had moved forward as it always did, carrying David with it, carrying him into a life that no longer included the space Arthur had once occupied, leaving behind only the quiet, growing absence that now filled the house with an echo that routine could not silence. Arthur closed his eyes briefly, the realization settling deeper, no longer abstract, no longer something that could be examined from a distance, but something that belonged to him, something that required more than understanding. It required action. The conductor's words returned then, clearer than ever before, stripped of their mystery, revealed not as a riddle, but as a simple truth he had not been willing to face. You forgot your baggage. No, he had not forgotten. He had left it behind. And until he chose to pick it up, until he was willing to carry it, to acknowledge it, to confront it, to speak the words he had avoided for so long, there would be no train for him, no movement forward, no escape from the station that existed not in the world but within himself. Arthur opened his eyes again, the room unchanged, the morning light now stronger, filling the space with a quiet clarity that felt almost deliberate, as though the world itself had shifted in response to what he had finally understood. For a long moment he remained still, the weight of the realization settling into him, reshaping something fundamental, something he had not realized had been so rigid until it began to give way. He knew now. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Enough to understand that the dream would not stop. Not until he did something about it. And for the first time since it had begun, the question was no longer what does it mean, but something far more difficult. What are you going to do about it? The day unfolded with a quiet heaviness that Arthur could neither ignore nor fully confront, as though the realization that had taken root within him before dawn had altered something fundamental in the rhythm of his life, turning even the simplest actions into moments weighed down by thought, by hesitation, by the persistent awareness that something long postponed now stood directly before him, waiting not for understanding, but for a decision. He carried the wooden locomotive with him from room to room, not consciously at first, but as if guided by an instinct he had not yet named, placing it on the kitchen table as the coffee brewed, moving it to the arm of Martha's chair when he sat, resting it finally on the workbench in the workshop where it seemed both entirely out of place and yet deeply rooted in everything that had once given that space meaning. The smell of sawdust lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the sharp, familiar scent of black coffee, and as Arthur stood there with his hands resting on the worn surface of the bench, his fingers tracing the grooves left by years of labor, he found himself staring at the object before him not as something finished, but as something unresolved, something that, like the distance between him and his son, had never truly reached its final form. The phone sat nearby. It had been there all along, an ordinary presence among tools and scattered materials, but now it seemed to occupy more space than it should, drawing his attention again and again with a quiet insistence that was impossible to ignore, its stillness somehow louder than any sound it might have made. Arthur glanced at it, then away, then back again, the movement subtle but repeated, as though his mind circled the possibility without allowing itself to land. He knew the number. Of course he did. It had not been dialed in years, but it had never left him, remaining somewhere beneath the surface, as familiar as the lines on his hands, as the sound of Martha's voice, as the memory of a boy who had once looked at him with trust that he had not known how to protect. All it would take was a single motion, a reach, a press of fingers, a decision, And yet, the simplicity of the action stood in stark contrast to the weight of what it represented, because the call was not merely a call, it was an admission, a surrender of something he had carried for so long that it had become part of him, indistinguishable from who he believed himself to be. Bride. It did not announce itself loudly, nor did it present itself as something negative or destructive. Instead, it settled quietly into his thoughts, offering reasons, explanations, justifications that felt reasonable, even necessary. What if David did not answer? What if he did? But the silence between them proved too vast to bridge. What if the words Arthur had held back for so long arrived too late, no longer needed, no longer wanted? The possibilities unfolded one after another, each one reinforcing the same conclusion, that perhaps it was better to leave things as they were, to avoid reopening something that might not be reparable, to preserve in silence what little remained untouched. Arthur exhaled slowly, the breath uneven, and reached for the phone at last, his hand hovering over it for a moment before closing around it, the familiar weight settling into his palm, grounding him in the reality of the choice before him. He turned it over, his thumb brushing lightly against the screen, hesitating just before the point of action. And in that brief pause, the fear that had remained unspoken finally took shape. It was not rejection he feared most. Not entirely. It was the possibility that nothing had been left waiting for him on the other end. That the years of silence had not merely created distance, but had erased something that could not be restored, leaving behind not anger, not resentment, but absence. An absence, he realized, was far harder to confront. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, his grip tightening slightly, and though the image of the station rose once more in his mind, the fog, the train, the conductor's quiet, unyielding words, it did not bring clarity this time, only pressure. Only the growing awareness that understanding alone was no longer enough. He opened his eyes again, staring at the phone, at the single action that stood between him and everything he had yet to face, and for a long moment, he remained suspended there, caught between what he knew he should do and what he could not yet bring himself to begin. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, he lowered the phone. He set it back down on the workbench, not with finality, not with certainty, but with hesitation that lingered in the air long after his hand had withdrawn, and as he stepped back, the distance between himself and that small, silent object felt far greater than the space it occupied. The workshop returned to stillness. The scent of wood remained. The faint ticking of the clock reached him once more. And though nothing had outwardly changed, Arthur felt, with a quiet heaviness that settled deep within him, that he had made a choice. Not to act. Not yet. But time, as he was beginning to understand, did not wait for readiness. And somewhere just beyond the edge of thought, something was already preparing to remind him of that truth in a way he would not be able to ignore. When night came again, it did not bring rest. Arthur lay in bed longer than usual, his eyes open in the dimness, the slow, measured ticking of the clock marking each passing second with a persistence that felt sharper than before, as though the quiet itself had taken on a new intensity, one that mirrored the tension he had carried with him throughout the day. He had done nothing. The realization sat with him, not accusatory, not yet, but present enough to be felt, to be acknowledged. And as sleep finally began to take hold, it did not feel like surrender, but like something inevitable, something that would lead him not away from what he had avoided, but directly back to it. The station returned, but it was not the same. From the moment the dream formed around him, there was a difference. A subtle distortion at first, barely noticeable, like a familiar melody played slightly out of tune. But as Arthur became aware of himself standing once more on the platform, that distortion began to deepen, spreading through the space with a quiet, unsettling persistence. The fog was thicker. Not soft and drifting as before, but dense, heavy, pressing in from all sides, reducing the world to fragments, swallowing the distant edges of the station until only what stood closest remained visible, and even that seemed less certain, as though it might dissolve at any moment. The lamps flickered erratically, their light unstable, casting shadows that shifted too quickly, stretching and retracting in ways that felt wrong, that disrupted the fragile sense of order that had once defined the dream. Arthur felt it immediately. Something was breaking. The passengers were still there, but their movements had changed, no longer calm or deliberate, but hurried, unsettled, their footsteps uneven, their voices rising just enough to suggest unease, as though they too sensed that whatever held the station together was beginning to fail. The train stood waiting, but even it seemed different, its presence less solid, its outline wavering slightly within the thickening fog, as though it were already beginning to slip away. Arthur tried to move. More urgently this time. More forcefully. But the restraint that held him remained unyielding, and for the first time it was not merely frustrating. It was frightening because now more than ever, he understood what it meant to remain where he was. His gaze snapped toward the bench. The boy was there. Alone. The wooden locomotive rested in his hands, but it no longer moved, no longer traced that quiet, repetitive path. Instead, it lay still, held tightly, as though the absence of motion itself carried meaning. Arthur felt something rise within him, sharp and immediate. "David!" he called out, his voice breaking through the space with a force that had not been possible before, the name echoing against the collapsing edges of the dream. This time the boy turned quickly, too quickly. His face, pale and streaked with tears, looked toward Arthur with a mixture of fear and something else, something that felt like waiting, like the final moment before giving up. "Don't go," Arthur tried to say, though the words felt tangled, incomplete, as though they could not form fast enough to match the urgency within him. The ground beneath the platform shifted. A low, distant rumble moved through the station, subtle at first, then growing, the wooden planks beneath Arthur's feet trembling slightly, the structure itself beginning to give way as though it could no longer hold together under the weight of what had been left unresolved. The whistle sounded, louder than ever before, longer, final. The train began to move. Not slowly, not with the patient departure of previous nights, but with sudden, decisive motion, its wheels grinding sharply against the tracks as it pulled away, cutting through the thick fog with a force that left no room for hesitation. "No." Arthur tried to step forward, his body straining against the invisible hold, his hands reaching out though the distance between them remained unchanged. The boy stood from the bench, for the first time, small, alone, left behind. "You promised," he said again, his voice breaking softer now, yet somehow carrying further than before, reaching Arthur with a clarity that made everything else fade. The platform cracked. A sharp sound split the air as the wood beneath them began to fracture, lines spreading outward, dividing the space into pieces that no longer held together, and the fog surged inward, swallowing the remaining light, turning the world into something unstable, something that could not last. Arthur shouted. Not words this time, not something formed or controlled, but a raw, desperate sound pulled from somewhere deeper than thought, deeper than memory, as the realization struck him with a force that left no room for denial. The train was leaving, and this time it might not come back. The boy's figure blurred, fading into the thickening fog, his outline dissolving just as the last visible car of the train disappeared into the distance, taking with it the final trace of motion, of possibility, of time still available. The station collapsed into silence. And then Arthur woke. He sat upright instantly, his breath ragged, his chest tight, the darkness of the room pressing in around him as though the dream had followed him back, refusing to release him even now, and for a long moment he could do nothing but sit there, listening to the frantic rhythm of his own heartbeat, feeling the echo of that final whistle still vibrating somewhere deep within him. This time there was no confusion, no hesitation. Only a single undeniable truth settling into place with absolute clarity. There might not be another chance. And if he let this one pass, there would be nothing left to return to. Arthur woke as though pulled sharply from the edge of something far deeper than sleep, his breath unsteady, his chest rising and falling with a force that made the quiet darkness of the room feel almost too small to contain what had just passed through him. And for a long moment he did not move, not because he could not, but because the weight of the realization settling within him required stillness, required acknowledgement, required at last a decision that could no longer be postponed. The echo of the dream lingered with an intensity unlike anything that had come before, not fading into the softness of waking as dreams often did, but remaining vivid, precise, as though it had crossed some unseen boundary and taken on a reality that demanded response rather than reflection. And as Arthur sat there on the edge of his bed, his hands resting against the worn fabric of the sheets, he understood with a clarity that left no room for doubt that what he had witnessed was not merely a warning, it was an ending already in motion. There might not be another chance. The thought did not arrive as panic nor as fear, but as something steadier, something far more decisive. And in that quiet, measured certainty, Arthur felt the long-held resistance within him begin to give way, not all at once, not dramatically, but with the slow, deliberate release of something that had been held too tightly for far too long. He rose. The movement was simple, almost unremarkable, yet it carried with it a significance that extended far beyond the act itself, because this was not the continuation of routine, not the quiet repetition of another day shaped by habit and avoidance, but the beginning of something different, something that required him to step beyond the boundaries he had drawn around his own life. The house remained still as he moved through it, the familiar sounds, soft creaks of the floorboards, the distant ticking of the clock, accompanying him as they always had, yet now they seemed to recede into the background, no longer defining the rhythm of his actions, but merely observing them. In the dim light of the hallway, he paused briefly by the clock, his gaze resting on its steady movement, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel measured by it, did not feel held back by the quiet insistence of passing time, but instead felt something shift within him, a recognition that time, though it could not be stopped, could still be met. He moved to the workshop. The door opened with its familiar creak, the scent of wood and linseed oil greeting him as it always had, grounding him in something tangible, something real, and as he stepped inside, his eyes went immediately to the workbench, to the place where the wooden locomotive rested, waiting not as an object, but as a reminder of everything that had led him to this moment. He picked it up carefully, his fingers closing around it with a firmness that had been absent before, and as he held it there, the weight of it seemed to settle differently in his hand, not as something from the past, but as something that belonged to what he was about to do. There were no more thoughts of calling, no more circling of possibilities, no more quiet negotiations with himself. Instead, there was only action. Arthur turned, leaving the workshop behind, moving with a steadiness that carried him through the house and toward the small closet near the door, where an old travel bag had remained unused for years, its presence a relic of a life that had once extended beyond the boundaries of this place. He took it down, the fabric worn but intact, and began to pack with simple efficiency, placing inside only what was necessary, each movement deliberate, unhurried, yet free of the hesitation that had defined him for so long, because the purpose behind it was clear. This was not a trip. It was a crossing. He added the wooden locomotive last, setting it gently into the bag as though ensuring that it remained within reach, not merely as an object, but as the reason itself, the tangible form of something he was finally ready to carry. The keys to his old pickup truck lay in their usual place, and when he picked them up, the faint metallic sound they made in his hand seemed louder than it should have been, echoing slightly in the quiet of the house, marking the moment in a way that felt almost ceremonial. Arthur paused at the door. Not out of doubt, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The house stood behind him as it always had, unchanged, holding within it the memories of a life that had shaped him, the presence of Martha in every corner, in every quiet detail that had remained untouched, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to take it in, to acknowledge what it had been, what it still was. "I'll fix it," he said quietly, the words spoken not loudly, not formally, but simply, as though offering something long overdue to the space that had witnessed his silence. Then he stepped outside. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of early autumn, and as he moved toward the truck, the sound of leaves shifting beneath his boots accompanied him, a soft, grounding rhythm that felt almost reassuring in its familiarity. He opened the door, placed the bag on the seat beside him, and as he settled into the worn interior, the engine coming to life with a low, steady hum, Arthur did not look back again. because for the first time in years he was no longer standing still. The road stretched ahead of him in long, quiet lines that cut through the landscape with a steady purpose, carrying Arthur forward beneath a sky that had only just begun to lighten, its pale tones gradually deepening as the morning unfolded, and as the truck moved along the familiar curves of the highway, the low hum of the engine blending with the soft, rhythmic sound of tires passing over scattered leaves, there was a sense, not of urgency, but of movement, that felt both unfamiliar and deeply necessary. Autumn had settled fully into the land. The trees that lined the road stood in muted brilliance, their leaves turned to shades of amber, rust, and fading gold, and as the wind moved through them, they responded with a gentle, continuous whisper that followed him as he drove, rising and falling in a quiet conversation that required no words to be understood. Arthur kept his hands steady on the wheel, his fingers wrapped firmly around it, the worn leather warm beneath his grip, and though his eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, his thoughts moved more freely now, no longer circling the same confined spaces, but unfolding gradually, carried forward by the motion itself. He had not called. The realization remained, but it no longer held the same weight of hesitation it had the day before, because the decision to come here, to take this road instead of remaining where he had been, had shifted something fundamental in the way he understood what needed to be done. Some things, he realized, could not be spoken from a distance. Some things required presence, required standing in front of another person, not with explanations carefully prepared, not with defenses constructed in advance, but with nothing more than the truth, however simple, however late it might be. The countryside passed by slowly, each mile revealing small, familiar scenes that seemed unchanged by time. Weathered barns standing against open fields, fences stretching along the edges of land that had been worked for generations, the occasional porch light still glowing faintly in the early hours, suggesting lives beginning their day in ways not so different from his own. And yet everything felt different, not because the world had changed, but because he had. Arthur rolled the window down slightly, letting the cool air enter the cab, carrying with it the scent of leaves and earth, a freshness that sharpened his awareness, grounding him in the present moment in a way that felt both steadying and necessary. His thoughts returned, as they often did, to David, not to the man he had become, not to the distance that had grown between them, but to the boy he had once known, the one who had sat on the floor of the workshop, watching, waiting, believing in something that Arthur had not known how to hold on to. "You promised." The words no longer echoed with accusation. Instead, they settled into him with a quiet clarity, not as something that could not be undone, but as something that could still be answered, if only he was willing to do so. Arthur tightened his grip slightly on the wheel, his gaze steady, the road unfolding before him without interruption, without hesitation, and for the first time since the dream had begun, he felt something that had been absent for a long while. Not certainty, not resolution, but the beginning of something close to peace. Because acknowledging a mistake, he realized, was not the same as being defined by it. And time, though it moved forward without pause, did not always close every door. Sometimes, if one was willing to step through it, it opened another. The miles passed. The sun rose higher, and as the landscape continued to shift around him, carrying him steadily toward a place he had not seen in years, Arthur understood that what awaited him at the end of the road was not simply a destination. It was a moment, one he had delayed for far too long, and this time he would not let it pass. By the time Arthur finally turned onto the quiet street where David now lived, the day had begun to settle into the softer tones of late afternoon, the sunlight stretching longer across the ground, casting gentle shadows that moved slowly with the passing hours. And though the road itself was no different from countless others he had driven before, there was something in the stillness of it, in the quiet order of the houses lined neatly along either side, that made each passing second feel heavier, more deliberate, as though the world itself understood the significance of where he had arrived. He slowed the truck as he approached the address, his eyes scanning the houses not with uncertainty, but with a quiet, growing recognition until at last he saw it. A modest home well kept, with a small yard where the grass had been recently cut and a porch that held the faint signs of daily life, of routines and rhythms that had continued without him. Arthur pulled over and turned off the engine. The sudden silence that followed was not unfamiliar, yet here in this place it carried a different weight, one that pressed gently against him, asking, not forcing but asking, whether he was ready to step forward. He did not move immediately. Instead, he remained seated, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the house, taking in the details one by one, as though committing them to memory before allowing himself to become part of them. The front windows reflected the fading light, but beyond the glass he could see movement, shadows passing, brief and indistinct, suggesting life within, conversations, laughter perhaps, the quiet unfolding of an evening that did not yet include him. Then from the side of the yard came the sound of children. Soft at first, then clearer, carried by the breeze as it moved through the trees, a light, unguarded laughter that rose and fell in uneven bursts, uncontained and effortless in a way that only children's voices could be. And as Arthur turned his head slightly, following the sound, he saw them. Two small figures moving quickly across the grass, their steps uneven, their energy unrestrained, chasing something invisible to him but entirely real to them. Their joy expressed not in words but in motion, in the simple act of being together. His breath caught. He did not know them. Not their names, not their voices, not the small ordinary details that form the foundation of connection. And yet, something in him responded immediately, instinctively, recognizing in them not strangers, but something far more personal, something he had been absent from, something that had continued to grow without him. His grandchildren. The word formed quietly in his mind, carrying with it a weight that was not heavy, but deep, settling into him with a clarity that left no room for denial, and for a moment, he simply watched them, his hands unmoving, his presence still contained within the boundaries of the truck, as though stepping beyond it would require more than he was yet certain he could give. The house remained ahead of him, the door closed, the distance small, and yet it felt immense. Arthur exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting back to the front of the house, to the path that led from where he sat to where everything he had come for now waited, and for a moment, just a moment, the familiar hesitation returned, not as strongly as before, not with the same authority, but present enough to be felt. What if it was too late? What if the door opened and nothing remained? What if the silence he had allowed to grow had become something permanent? The questions lingered, quiet but persistent, and as he sat there, the engine now silent, the world continuing around him without pause, he realized that the fear he felt was not something to be eliminated, not something to be solved before action could be taken. It was something to move through. Arthur reached for the bag beside him, his hand closing around the worn fabric, feeling the solid shape of the wooden locomotive inside, its presence grounding him, reminding him not of the past alone, but of the reason he had come. He opened the door. The cool air met him as he stepped out, carrying with it the faint scent of leaves and distant earth, and as his boots touched the ground, there was no dramatic shift, no sudden clarity, only the simple, undeniable fact that he had begun. He walked toward the house. Each step measured, steady, carrying him forward across the small distance that had once felt insurmountable, and as he reached the porch, the wood beneath his feet giving a quiet creak, he paused for a final moment, not out of doubt but out of acknowledgement. Then with a slow, deliberate motion, he raised his hand and knocked. The sound of the knock lingered in the air longer than Arthur expected, not loud, not forceful, but clear enough to carry through the quiet interior of the house, and as he lowered his hand, the stillness that followed seemed to expand, filling the space between what had been and what was about to unfold, leaving him standing there on the porch, suspended in a moment that felt both fragile and irreversible. Footsteps approached from within, measured, unhurried, yet distinct enough to be felt as much as heard, each one closing the distance on the other side of the door until at last they stopped. The handle turned. The door opened. For a brief second, neither of them moved. David stood there, framed by the soft light of the house behind him, older now than the man Arthur still carried in his memory, his features shaped by time, by experience, by years that had unfolded without the presence of the person now standing before him. And yet, beneath all of that, there remained something unmistakably familiar, something that had not been erased by distance or silence. Arthur felt it immediately. Not recognition alone, but connection, strained, buried, yet still present. David's expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the complexity of the moment, the layers of emotion that rose and settled within him almost simultaneously. Surprise, uncertainty, something guarded, something waiting. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, not empty but full, carrying within it the weight of 10 years, of words unspoken, of questions unanswered, of everything that had led them here. Arthur did not rush to fill it. He did not reach for explanations, did not attempt to construct a bridge from language that might fail under the weight of what it was meant to carry, because for the first time, he understood that what mattered was not how he said it, but that he did. Slowly he reached into the bag. The movement was simple, deliberate, his hand steady as he withdrew the wooden locomotive, holding it carefully as though it required no protection, yet deserved it all the same, and when he lifted it slightly, bringing it into view, the gesture carried with it everything he had not known how to express before. "I brought my baggage," he said. The words were quiet, unadorned, but they did not need to be anything more. For a moment David did not respond. His gaze moved from Arthur's face to the object in his hands, recognition flickering across his expression as memory surfaced, not in fragments but whole, immediate, undeniable, and as he looked at it, something in his posture softened, not fully, not instantly, but enough to shift the space between them. Arthur did not look away. He stood there, the locomotive held forward slightly, not as an offering to be accepted or rejected, but as a truth presented without condition, without expectation, without defense. "I should have come sooner," he added, his voice steady, though quieter now, as though the weight of the words required less force, not more. "I should have said it back then." The apology was not elaborate. It did not revisit the past in detail, did not assign blame, did not attempt to explain what could no longer be changed. Simply existed. And for a moment that was enough. David's eyes lifted from the locomotive back to Arthur, the silence between them shifting once more, no longer held in place by distance alone, but by something that now had the possibility of being crossed. "You took your time," David said, the faintest trace of something, perhaps humor, perhaps restraint, touching his voice, softening what might once have been sharper. Arthur allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible breath. "I did," he replied. Another pause. But this one felt different. Less rigid. Less final. David stepped forward. Not far. Just enough. The distance between them closed in a way that required no words, no further explanation, and when he reached out, the gesture was not hesitant, not forced, but natural, as though something that had been held back had finally been allowed to move. Arthur met him there. The embrace was not dramatic, not overwhelming, but it was real, solid, the kind of contact that carried more meaning than anything that could have been said, bridging years of silence in a single quiet moment that neither of them rushed to end. And as they stood there, the weight that Arthur had carried for so long, unspoken, unacknowledged, unresolved, began at last to lift. A month passed not with the slow, empty repetition that had once defined Arthur's days, but with a quiet fullness that revealed itself not in grand moments, but in the small, ordinary details that had returned to his life in ways he had not expected. And as he sat now on the porch beside David, the evening settling gently around them, there was a stillness present that felt entirely different from the silence he had once known. It was no longer hollow. It was shared. The air carried the familiar scent of autumn, softened now by the subtle warmth of late sunlight, and as the leaves shifted lightly in the breeze, their quiet movement seemed less like a reminder of passing time and more like something continuous, something ongoing, part of a rhythm that no longer excluded him. One of the children, his grandson, sat nearby, absorbed in the simple, focused task of guiding a small wooden locomotive along the edge of the porch, the wheels moving in a soft, steady line, forward and back, echoing a motion that Arthur now understood not as repetition, but as connection. He watched him for a moment, his gaze steady, thoughtful, and when the boy looked up briefly, meeting his eyes with a simple, unguarded smile, Arthur returned it, not out of effort but naturally, as though something within him had finally settled into place. David shifted slightly beside him, the faint creak of the porch beneath their weight blending with the quiet sounds of the evening, and though neither of them spoke for a while, the silence between them no longer demanded to be filled, because it carried with it an understanding that had already been reached. Eventually, the light began to fade. The sky deepened into softer tones, the edges of the world settling into shadow, and as the day gave way to night, Arthur rose slowly, the movement unhurried, his body responding not with resistance, but with a quiet ease that had been absent before. "I should get some rest," he said, his voice calm, steady. David nodded. "See you in the morning." Arthur stepped inside. The house was different from his own, unfamiliar in its layout, its sounds, its subtle details, and yet it did not feel foreign, not in the way he might have expected, because the presence within it, the voices, the movement, the quiet signs of life, had already begun to reshape his understanding of what it meant to belong. He moved through the hallway, the soft glow of a lamp guiding his way, and when he reached the room prepared for him, he paused briefly, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition of how far he had come, not in distance but in something far less tangible, yet far more significant. Arthur lay down. The bed was unfamiliar, the room quiet in a different way, yet as he settled into it, there was no restlessness, no lingering tension, no echo of something unresolved pressing at the edges of his thoughts. Only stillness, only ease. His eyes closed, and for the first time in a long while, when sleep came, it did not carry him back to the station, did not return him to the fog, the platform, the train that had always left without him. There was no conductor, no waiting, no fergatembaghi, only darkness, gentle and complete, holding within it not absence but rest. And as the night deepened, Arthur Pendleton slept, not as a man left behind, but as one who had finally, at last, found his way forward.